I always loved Halloween. It was the one time a year my parents really let loose and let the house transform into something right out of a horror movie. Every year we'd pick a different theme. Sometimes haunted houses, other times spooky graveyards. We'd go all out. Tombstones in the yard, cobwebs hanging from every corner, a fog machine that coated the lawn, and this eerie mist. Our front porch became the stage for all sorts of creepy displays. Fake corpses, animatronic monsters, whatever fit the theme for that year. But hands down, the best part was the costumes. My parents were both pros when it came to putting together outfits. There really wasn't a year we didn't win the unofficial neighborhood contest for best dressed family. Halloween was practically sacred in our household. The Halloween when I was in 8th grade, though, was a little different. That year, my parents decided to give me a bit more freedom since I was getting older now. I got to pick out my own costume, something a little edgier than the usual pirate or superhero that I'd gone with in the past. This time, I dressed up as a zombie, full makeup, tattered clothes, the whole shebang. My friends and I had been talking about it for weeks, planning to cause a bit of mischief, hit up every house on the block, and see who could collect the most candy by the end of the night. It was going to be epic. The night would start as you all might expect. My friends and I just wandering around the neighborhood, laughing, shouting, daring one another to knock on the creepiest house that we could find. We filled our bags with candy and even managed to pull a couple of harmless pranks. Nothing too serious, just enough to get the adrenaline going. By the time I made it back home, it was around 10 p.m. My legs had ached from walking up and down all those streets. When I stepped through the door, I was greeted with a surprise. My parents had waited up for me, which wasn't all that shocking. They were pretty big on family time, even during Halloween. But what caught me off guard was the fact that they'd set up the living room for a late-night movie marathon. And not just any movie either, they had picked out the Amityville Horror. I'd been asking to watch it for years, and they always said no because it was too scary. I'd have nightmares. Now, they figured I was old enough. I guess being in 8th grade came with some perks. "How about it?" my dad said, grinning at me from the couch. "You still up for it?" "Yeah," I answered, trying to sound cooler than I actually felt. Honestly, I was kind of nervous. I mean, sure, I liked horror movies, but the Amityville Horror was a different league of its own. That opening scene where the father kills his whole family, I'd heard people talk about it. It always gave me chills just imagining it. But I was not about to back down now. I threw myself onto the couch, still in my zombie getup, pillowcase full of candy, resting close beside me. The lights were dimmed, and the living room was bathed in the flickering glow of the TV screen as the movie began. My dad settled into his recliner, my mom beside him with a blanket draped over her lap. As the opening credits rolled, I popped a piece of candy into my mouth, heart thudding in my chest. The movie wasted no time getting underneath my skin. The slow, deliberate pacing, the eerie creaking of the house in the film, and the way the father's descent into madness was portrayed. It all felt too real. When that scene came where he brutally murders his family, I couldn't help but flinch. I wasn't about to admit it, but I was terrified. Somewhere along the halfway point during the movie, my dad started to nod off in his recliner. He mumbled something about going to bed and then headed down the hall toward the bedroom, leaving just me and my mom to finish up the movie. I watched him go, suddenly feeling more exposed than I was. It was silly, I knew it was, it's just a movie, but there was just something about watching in the dark for the first time. Just the two of us. It made the house seem all too quiet. We kept watching, but my mind was now wandering, the movie fading into the background. The shadows outside seemed darker than usual. The wind picked up and caused the porch swing to creak. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, trying to shake off the unease that was now settling in my stomach. And then I saw something off. At first I thought it was the trick of a light, just a reflection or maybe some decoration my parents had put outside on the porch. But the longer I stared, the more I realized that was not the case. There was definitely a shadow out there, faint but unmistakable, standing on the outside of the front door. My breath caught in my throat as I leaned forward, squinting through the window. It was the shape of a person. For a second, I thought about ignoring it, convincing myself it's just my imagination running wild after watching this horror movie. The shape didn't move, it just stood there, motionless, right by the front door, as if waiting for something. "Mom! Mom!" I whispered, my voice tight with fear. "There's somebody outside." My mom turned her head, frowning as she followed my gaze to the window. She stood up slowly, her face draining of color as she caught sight of the figure for herself. "Get away from the window, now," she said sharply, her voice barely even above a whisper. Then, without another word, she quickly bolted down the hall, calling for my father. I just stayed there frozen on the couch, heart pounding in my ears. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the window. That figure was still there, barely visible, but enough to send a chill down my spine. As I watched, they shifted, stepping into the dim light of the porch. And that's when I noticed it was a her. It wasn't a person in a costume like I first thought it was. No, it was an old woman. Gray hair, frizzy and wild. Her face was gaunt and lined with these deep wrinkles. She was wearing a tattered nightgown, and in her hand, she held a large kitchen knife, blade glinting in that faint light. Now my stomach was really twisting as I noticed the stains on her clothes. Before I could react, my dad came rushing back into the room, wearing nothing but a t-shirt and his underwear, a shotgun now clutched in his hands. He strode over to the window, tapping on the glass with the barrel of the gun. "Get out of here," he growled, his voice steady but laced with tension. "The police are already on their way." The woman did not budge. Instead, she turned her head slowly, her eyes locking now onto mine. For a moment, I was convinced she could see me through the window, as she knew I was watching her. That's when she started to move, these jerky, erratic movements, as if she wasn't fully in control of her body. She raised the knife and slammed it into the front door, again and again, her voice rising in these ragged screams. "He's dead! He's dead! I don't know who killed him, but he's dead!" The sound of the knife hitting the door echoed through the house, each strike sending a fresh wave of terror throughout me. My dad again tapped the glass, harder this time. "I said get out of here!" But she didn't stop. She kept stabbing the door, her movements growing more and more frantic, and her screams more desperate. "He's dead! He's dead! I don't know who did it!" She screamed again. I couldn't move, I couldn't even breathe. All I could do was sit there and watch in horror as this woman, this stranger, tore into our front door with a knife, her voice shaking with a madness that I couldn't even begin to comprehend. Then, as suddenly as it started, it was over. The woman let out one final guttural scream before turning and then bolting off into the night, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as she appeared. For a few more minutes, none of us moved. My dad stood by the window, shotgun still in his hands, chest rising and falling with deep, controlled breaths. My mom came back into the room, her face still pale, her eyes now wide with shock. The only sound was the faint hum of the TV, where the Amityville horror was still playing. The horrifying events on screen now completely overshadowed by what had just taken place in real life. My dad finally broke the silence. "Call the police," he just said. The next few hours were a blur. The police arrived quickly, I'll give them that, and took our statements from my parents while I sat on the couch, still in that zombie costume, processing what had just taken place. They asked if we knew the woman, but none of us did. She was a complete stranger, someone we'd never seen before, someone who seemingly had just snapped. They did find her a bit later, on the edge of a neighboring property, babbling incoherently about how everything was trying to kill her. They also found her husband inside their home, barely alive but still breathing, his body covered in stab wounds. They took him to the hospital, but we didn't know what happened after that. There were rumors around the neighborhood, of course, that she'd gone mad and that she was a schizophrenic, that she had been off her meds for weeks. A few other neighbors had also found mutilated animals inside their neighborhood, mostly just local pets. If it was that woman, she was truly off her rocker for a while. That night definitely changed everything for me though. Halloween was never the same after that. Sure, we still decorated the house and handed out candy to the neighborhood kids, but it wasn't like it was. Not for me, at least. Halloween had always been this fun, lighthearted time where I could be somebody else, where I could get lost in the thrill of pretending. That night, though, something just broke inside me. The magic of it all disappeared, replaced by an uneasy knot in my stomach that never really quite went away. For a while, I didn't even want to talk about it. I just kept telling myself it was just some kind of freak occurrence, wrong place, wrong time, that kind of thing. But at night, when the house was quiet and dark, I'd replay that scene of that woman's face over and over in my mind. The wild, haunted look in her eyes, the way she gripped that knife. It was like the only thing tethering her to reality. The sounds of her scream, how they pierced through the walls and then echoed in my ears long after she vanished into the night. I think the worst part though was just this sense of helplessness. I'd been sitting there just a few feet away from the front door and I really couldn't do a damn thing. I couldn't stop her, I couldn't protect my family. All I could do was just sit and watch as everything unfolded, as this stranger, a woman I'd never seen before, descended into madness right there on her front porch. I never felt so vulnerable in my entire life. All the while hearing the audio from the Amityville horror laid right over the top of the chaos, it just made it that much worse. Shockingly enough, the police followed up with us a few days later, just to let us know what they'd found. The woman had indeed been living with her husband on our street, just a few houses down. They'd been there for years, though I don't remember ever crossing paths with them. According to a few of the officers, her mental health had deteriorated rapidly in the weeks leading up to that night. She'd been on medication for a while, and her paranoia had gotten the best of her. She did indeed believe everybody was out to get her. Her husband was also trying to kill her. When she finally snapped, she turned on him. Thankfully, he survived the attack, but barely. By the time the police found her, she was completely unhinged, rambling about demons and conspiracies, completely disconnected from reality itself. They didn't tell us what happened to her after that, but I assume she was sent away to some kind of facility, a place where she couldn't hurt anybody else or herself. I'll admit there was a part of me that kind of felt bad for her. What kind of nightmare must she have been living in to do something like that? But the other part of me could not shake that fear. What if she hadn't run off? What if she had somehow broken down the door? What if I'd been the one standing there on the other side of the glass when she swung that knife? I tried to bury it and just push the memory down, forget about it all. But without fail, every single Halloween after that, I found myself looking over my shoulder, listening for the creak of the porch swing, glancing at the shadows just outside the windows. My parents did try to keep things normal, decorations, costumes, the usual, but even they were a little more cautious now, a little more on edge. My dad would install some better locks in the doors and even added a security system. Kept that shotgun even closer. We never really talked about it after that night though. It was just like this unspoken agreement. We all knew what happened, but none of us wanted to acknowledge just how close it had come to being something much, much worse. I do wonder now too, how much of what we actually see on horror movies like the Amityville Horror, with the ghost and demonic forces, are really just reflections of horrors that exist in our world every single day. The kind that you really don't expect to see. The kind that knock on your door on a quiet Halloween night and leave your life forever changed. Growing up, holidays were always a really big deal for my family. It wasn't about the gifts or the food. It was just about the tradition itself. The gathering of everybody from miles around. And the feeling that we were all a part of something much larger than just our little family of four. My mom and dad would pack up my brother Chris and I into the car, and we'd make a half-an-hour drive to my grandparents' house inside a quiet little town. It was the same routine every year, starting out with Halloween. There's just something special about that first trip of the season, though, kicking off what felt like an endless string of celebrations: Halloween, Thanksgiving, and then Christmas. The grand finale was always New Year's, but by then, the magic would wane a little. And that's when we were just kind of ready for a break from the chaos. Grandma and Grandpa, though, lived on this large, creaky house at the very end of their street. An old Victorian thing with peeling paint and overgrown shrubs that honestly looked like something out of a ghost story. Just a few doors down was Aunt Jane's house, smaller but newer, with flower beds that were always nice and neat. That's where my cousin Penelope lived, along with her baby brother Benjamin. Whenever we would visit, it wasn't just a family affair. Penelope and I, along with Chris and whatever neighborhood kids that happened to be around, would get up to all kinds of mischief together. Trick-or-treating was obviously a given, but it was the in-between moments, the time before and after that really stuck with me for all these years. There was one little added layer of tension for those visits, though. Teresa. She lived in the house between my grandparents and my Aunt Jane's, if you can even call it a house. It was more like a shack, a grim, sagging structure that seemed to be decaying before our very eyes each and every year. No one knew too much about her. My parents and grandparents always said the same thing, though. Stay away from Teresa's house. Don't even go near her yard. It wasn't really hard to follow that rule, though, because there was just something about her that made your skin crawl. You wouldn't want to go near her. Teresa was huge, over 6 feet tall, with a body that seemed like it had been built to move boulders themselves. She wore the same denim overalls and flannel shirts every time we saw her, her broad shoulders straining against the fabric. She had this necklace of bones, which I never really wanted to look at too closely, hung around her thick neck, and she stomped around these heavy work boots like she was always in the middle of some grim task. Her yard was surrounded by this old, rusted wire fence, and inside that fence, a chaotic mess of cats and dogs would be roaming, animals that looked just as feral as the property that they guarded. We'd hear Teresa scream at them, her voice literally echoing down the street as she tended her garden or scrubbed the outside of her house with soap and a giant sponge, an activity that seemed pretty bizarre even back then. That year, Halloween was colder than usual. The sky was a deep purple by the time we got into our costumes, and the chill in the air made everything just feel a little sharper, a little more alive. Penelope, Chris, and I had met up with a couple of other neighborhood kids, Max and Caitlin, if I remember right, and set off into the night to collect as much candy as we could carry. It was the usual routine: knock on doors, shout trick or treat, get some candy, then run off to the next house. You know the drill. By the time we'd gone through most of the neighborhood, we had pillowcases full of candy. We're feeling extra bold, invincible almost, as kids tend to feel when they're hyped up on sugar along with excitement. That's when Max got the idea. "What if we go to Teresa's house?" he said, his eyes gleaming with a dangerous mix of mischief and peer pressure. We all stopped dead in our tracks, glancing toward the dark, crumbling shape of her house just a few yards away. Her windows were dark, her yard silent. It was the only house on the street that didn't have any decorations. Not one pumpkin or fake spider web. Just the looming shadow of the shack, the tangled mess of her overgrown garden. Penelope was the first one to speak. No way. My mom will kill me." "Come on," Max urged, his voice dropping to a whisper, like he was sharing the best secret in the world. "It's Halloween. What's she gonna do? She'll probably scare us or something, but isn't that the whole point?" Chris, who was always the more cautious of the two of us, shook his head immediately. "We're not supposed to go near her house," my dad said. I, on the other hand, was feeling that same rush that Max was. This was our chance, was it not? A chance to prove to ourselves that we aren't afraid of her. All those stories were just that, stories. Let's just "Knock," I said, feeling the words tumble out before I could even stop them. What's the worst thing that could happen, guys? So that's exactly what we did. The 5 of us crept up to Teresa's porch, our footsteps almost comically loud on the cracked stone path that led directly up to her front door. Up close, her house looked even worse. The wood was swollen and splintering. The roof was sagging in the middle. There was no doorbell, just a solid weather-beaten door that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. Max was the first one to knock. A quick, sharp rap that sounded much louder than it should have in the stillness of the night. Nothing happened. We waited, shuffling our feet and glancing at each other nervously. Max knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. For a second, I thought we were all safe, that maybe she wasn't even home. We could all laugh this off, head back to Aunt Jane's, and get some hot chocolate. But then that's when we heard it, a faint shuffling, coming from somewhere deep within the house. It was the sound of something being dragged across the floor, followed by a series of muffled thuds, like furniture being overturned. We all froze. The shuffling got louder, more frantic now. Then there was a big, loud crash, followed by this long, low moan that made my stomach twist almost immediately. "What the hell?" Penelope whispered to us, her voice trembling. Before anybody could react, the door creaked open, just a crack at first, then wider, then enough for a dim, flickering light to spill out onto the porch in front of us. It was coming from somewhere deep within the house, far beyond the doorway, casting a long, distorted shadow across the floor. At first I couldn't see much, just a glimpse of something moving in the darkness, and then it slowly appeared in the doorway. At first I thought it was a mask, a grotesque, lifelike mask with hollow eyes and sagging skin, dangling from a mop of tangled hair. But then I saw the hand, the knotted, weathered finger, gripping the hair by the scalp and holding it up like some kind of trophy. It was a head, a human head, its mouth slack and open, eyes dull and lifeless. I couldn't breathe. Teresa stepped into view, her massive frame filling the doorway, and began to shake the head back and forth like it was some kind of puppet. Her voice was high-pitched and sing-songy, and it filled the air as she spoke for it.
"Oh dear,"
she crooned, making the head bob up and down.
"You've made a mistake, children. A terrible, terrible mistake."
My legs felt like they locked into place, rooted to the spot as her voice changed, growing darker, harsher.
"I can't wait for you all to spend the night in hell."
And that was it. Something snapped inside of me, and before I knew it, I was sprinting, tearing down that street with the others close behind me. I could hear Penelope screaming. I could hear Chris sobbing. But I didn't stop. I didn't look back. We didn't stop until we were back inside my grandparents' house, breathless and shaking, trying to explain to the adults what had just happened. Of course they didn't believe us. "She's just an old woman," Grandma said, her voice soothing as she passed out mugs of hot chocolate. "She was trying to scare you, that's all." The way the blood had been dripping from the head, the way it smelled like something rotting. It couldn't have been a Halloween prop, was it? It looked all too real. We didn't go near Teresa's house again after that. The rest of the holiday passed in this strange, tense blur. But a few months later, just after Thanksgiving, Aunt Jane had an encounter that proved we hadn't imagined it all. She'd been unloading her groceries from the car, holding baby Benjamin in one arm when she felt like somebody had come up behind her. At first she thought it was my grandpa, but then she felt something cold and sharp press against her neck. Aunt Jane froze, her heart pounding in her chest as she realized what was happening. Something was being pulled back and forth across her neck, something sharp. She could feel the jagged teeth biting into her skin, the cold metal sawing at her flesh. It was a bone saw. In a blind panic, she tightened her grip on baby Benjamin and kicked back with her leg as hard as she could. The blade snagged for a moment, and she used the opportunity to lunge forward, wrenching herself free from that makeshift noose. She dropped the grocery bags and sent cans and boxes scattering across the driveway, spun around to see who was attacking her. It was Teresa. Teresa stood there, panting heavily, bone saw still clutched in her massive hands. Her eyes were wide and wild, her face completely twisted. Without a word, she lifted the saw again and tried to lunge at my Aunt Jane once more. That's when Aunt Jane did the only thing she could do. She ran. Benjamin still cradled in her arms, she sprinted down the street screaming for help, her throat burning with the effort. Behind her, she could hear Teresa's heavy boots pounding the pavement, chasing her, gaining on her. By some miracle, Aunt Jane had made it to my grandparents' house. She barely had time to pound on the door before Grandpa threw it open, a look of terror all over his face. He took one look at Jane and then saw the blood trickling down her neck and the panic in her eyes, knew something was immediately wrong. Without a word, he grabbed the fire poker from beside the fireplace and stepped outside, ready to defend his family. Teresa was only a few yards away, still brandishing that same saw. Grandpa did not hesitate. He swung that fire poker as hard as he could, connecting with Teresa's shoulder with a sickening crack. She stumbled back and faltered for the first time. Grandpa swung again, this time aiming for her head, and that second blow sent her crashing to the ground, bone saw falling from her hands and clattering across the pavement. The police arrived a little while later, and Aunt Jane went to the hospital, where she received several stitches for that gash on her neck. She was lucky. A few more seconds or a minute, and Teresa would have easily finished that job. The real horror came when the police searched Teresa's house, though. They found the dismembered body of a man in her basement, his limbs carefully severed and stacked in this neat pile. His head was missing, they found that too, propped up on the table in the corner of the room. It was the same head that she'd shown us on Halloween night. It was real. It had always been real. The police found more than just that body, though. They discovered an entire section of the basement that Teresa had dug out herself, a deep, claustrophobic pit that led to what could only be described as a crypt. There were symbols carved into the walls, crude drawings of people's faces and what looked like offerings, bones, some trinkets, even photographs. The people in the photos were never identified, at least to my knowledge, and neither was the man whose body they found in the basement. Teresa was arrested, of course, but she didn't go to prison. After a very brief trial, she was declared insane and mentally unwell, then committed to a mental institution. From my understanding, she never spoke a word during the trial, not one single word. Even when they showed her photographs of the man that she'd killed. The only time that she reacted was when they asked her about the basement, about that crypt that she had built. And even then, she didn't speak, only smiled and nodded. I believe she's still in that institution, or at least so I've been told. I still find myself thinking about her to this day, wondering what goes on in her mind. Does she remember us, the kids who knocked on her door on that Halloween night? Does she remember the head, the way she made it speak to us? Or is she just trapped in her own world, lost in whatever madness had driven her to kill? We don't really visit my grandparents' town much anymore, after what had happened. Aunt Jane even sold her house and moved to a different state, taking Penelope and Benjamin with her. My grandparents passed away a few years after that, and their old Victorian home was sold to some out-of-towners who probably don't even know the history of the place, or the horrors that happen just a few doors down. I always liked babysitting, especially for the Kelways. Their house was modern and sleek, not like my family's old creaky place where every gust of wind outside sounded like a ghost trying to get inside. No, the Kelway house had these thick, heavy doors with pristine white walls and high-tech security cameras on every single corner. It felt really safe. Plus, plus their 2 kids, Bentley and Madison, were very easy to manage. Bentley was 6, quiet for his age, with these big, observant eyes. Madison was 4, bubbly, and constantly seeking my attention like she'd never been ignored a day in her life. I'd babysat for them dozens and dozens of times before, so when Miss Kelway asked and offered to pay double for me to work Halloween, I didn't hesitate. At first, I was gonna say no. I had plans with my friends to go to a party, but when Miss Kelway mentioned that they'd pay double, I figured, why not? The money could cover some things that I've been eyeing online. Plus, it was only Halloween. How bad could it be? When I arrived at their house, the air had a chill to it, and the neighborhood was alive with kids in costumes running from door to door, bags held out for candy. The Kelway house had that usual festive look, with the pumpkins on the porch, a few fake spider webs in the bushes, and, of course, a plastic skeleton that dangled from the tree in their front yard. The kids were already bouncing off the walls in their superhero costumes. Bentley was dressed up as Iron Man, and Madison had on this fluffy pink unicorn outfit, complete with a sparkling horn. "Just keep an eye on them and try not to let them eat too much candy," Mr. Kelway said with a grin, adjusting his black vampire cape before slipping out the door with his wife. I think they were headed to some big costume party downtown and said they wouldn't be back until late. "We'll call to check in," Miss Kelway added, blowing a kiss to the kids before they both disappeared into the night. It was just me, Bentley, and Madison, and a bucket full of candy. We spent that first part of the night trick-or-treating in the neighborhood. The kids were excited, running ahead from house to house, yelling trick-or-treat at the top of their lungs. Every few minutes, I'd have to remind them not to run too far ahead or stop them from devouring too many sweets. It was a blast, but it was exhausting at the same time. The whole time, I kept an eye out for this creepy man that I'd seen earlier. He hadn't been wearing a costume, just this old ratty jacket and jeans, but I don't know, it was just something about the way he moved. It caught my attention. He'd been lurking at the edge of the sidewalk, watching the kids. I tried to shake it off. There's lots of parents walking around doing trick-or-treating. Maybe he was just waiting for his kids. Still, though, I mean, we ran into him a few times and not once did I ever see a child with him. The lack of kiddos and no costume, it was just a huge red flag to me. Add that disgruntled look on his face and you've got a walking weirdo in the neighborhood. When we got back to the Kelway house, it felt off. That guy had just gotten into my head, and the fact that he just disappeared after seeing him a few times creeped me out even more. The first weird thing happened when we were handing out candy. The kids and I were watching Hocus Pocus, all sitting by the front door with a bowl of candy, ready for the next round of trick-or-treaters. A couple of knocks and kids shouting trick-or-treat. I handed out candy like clockwork. But then came a knock that was harder than the others, almost like it was impatient, like somebody was pounding on the door with their fist and not even knocking. I opened up the door, expecting to see a group of kids, but it was him. The same man from earlier. Hair matted down with sweat, and his eyes were glazed over, like he hadn't slept at all. He just stood there, staring, breathing heavy, not saying a word. No kids, no costumes. What the fuck? "Can I help you?" I asked. He mumbled something, but it was too low to make out. "Excuse me, what?" I said, gripping the door frame, getting ready to shut it in his face. He mumbled again and then turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows. I slammed the door and immediately locked it, turned the deadbolt until it clicked. Even though that didn't really make me feel any safer. The house now felt colder, darker. I checked out the window, scanning the yard, but I could no longer see him. "Who is that?" Madison asked. "Nobody, don't worry about it. It's time for bed," I said. "But the movie isn't over," Bentley yelled out. We argued for a minute, but they ultimately gave in, stripped off their costumes, and started getting ready for bed. I told them they could stay up a little longer, but only if they hung out in their bedroom, so I knew they were safe. I tried to calm down, telling myself it's just some weirdo trying to spook me for Halloween. But just as I started to relax again, there was another knock. This time, it came from the back door. My stomach dropped. I had not heard anybody go around the house, and the back door opened up into the kitchen, which faced the backyard. Nobody should be back there. It wasn't the kind of place trick-or-treaters even went, wouldn't even be on their radar. I grabbed my phone and walked toward the kitchen, heart racing. The knocks were steady and deliberate, like whoever was there wanted me to know that they were waiting. I crept up to the door and carefully peeked through the blinds. Nothing, no one. Backyard was empty. The knocking had been so loud though, so clear. They had to be standing right there. I quickly turned the lock on the back door, making sure it was secure, and then backed away. All the while, the hairs on the back of my neck were now standing up. I called the Kelways, hands trembling as I dialed. When Mrs. Kelway answered, her voice was calm and bubbly, like nothing in the world was wrong.
"Hey, everything okay?"
she asked, clearly distracted by the noise of the party in the background. Yeah, I stammered out. There's this guy. He knocked at the door earlier, and now I think it might have been him knocking at the back door too, but I don't see anybody."
"Oh, it's probably just kids messing around,"
she said dismissively.
"Know how Halloween is. People love to play pranks. Don't worry about it. We will be home in an hour, though."
An hour? That felt like an eternity. "Okay," I said, though I wasn't convinced. "Just please hurry." I hung up and tried to shake it off, but those knocks started again, this time louder, more forceful, almost like somebody was punching the door now. The kids, I need to make sure they're okay. I rushed upstairs, trying to stay as quiet as I could, and peeked into Bentley and Madison's rooms. They were fine, laughing at the TV, completely oblivious to what was going on. I closed the door quietly, trying to not disturb them. I went back to the living room and paced, watching the clock. Every creak, every gust of wind outside would make me jump. Then there was another knock at the door. This time it was softer, polite almost. I crept to the window and peeked through the curtains. It was just Mr. Till from next door, with his 2 kids in tow, all dressed up in costumes. Relief flooded through me as I opened up the door. "Hey, trick or treat," Mr. Till said, holding out a plastic pumpkin for candy. I handed some to his kids, but he didn't seem to be in a rush to leave. He glanced up at the house and gave me a strange look. "Surprised to see you here, honestly," he said. "What do you mean?" I asked, confused. "Well, we passed by earlier and saw Mr. Kelway in his office. I figured he was home." My heart skipped a beat. "What?" I asked, trying to keep my voice from shaking. "Mr. Kelway isn't home. He and Mrs. Kelway are at a party." Mr. Till's smile faded, replaced by a concerned frown. Are you sure? Because I know I saw someone standing in his office, right through the window. Tall guy, I thought it was him." Just as he said that, we both heard it. A creak from upstairs. That kind of sound of old floorboards when somebody's walking across them. "There's somebody upstairs," I whispered, my voice barely audible. Mr. Till's eyes went wide. "Get out of the house now." He pulled out his phone and started dialing the police. "I'll go check," he said, pushing past me before I could stop him. "No, wait!" I tried to grab his arm, but he was already halfway up the stairs. I stood there frozen, just listening, as Mr. Till's heavy footsteps made their way to the second floor. Then a long, tense silence. "Hello?" Mr. Till called out. "Who's up here?" Nothing. I could hear him moving around, opening up doors and searching the rooms. Then suddenly a crash followed by shouting. "Hey, the hell out of here!" I heard more scuffling and the furniture being knocked over, and then the sounds of footsteps pounding down the stairs. I exploded into motion and ran for the kids' room, hurried them down the hall. We linked up with the Till's kids at the front door, then all of us paraded into the front yard. Mr. Till was still in the house, scrambling at the top of the stairs with whoever was inside. I could hear him talking. I realized he'd called the cops, and that's probably who he was speaking to in his phone. His kids started to freak out, so I did my best to calm them down while their dad was inside handling business. I'd say 5 seconds later, a cop car came sailing down the road, parked right in front of the house. At this point, Mr. Till came bounding outside. He scooped his kids up, and we all got a little further from the house and let the police go inside. There were 2 officers, both with guns drawn and flashlights cutting through the building. The cops rushed upstairs, and then within a few minutes, they had him. The same man who'd knocked on the door earlier. His disheveled appearance was even worse up close. His eyes were wild and darting around like a cornered animal. I watched in horror as they dragged him out of the house, his dirty clothes stained with something dark and wet. Later, we found out he had somehow slipped into the house while we were watching the movie. He had to have followed us home, watched from a distance, and then waited for his moment. The police said he likely snuck in through the back door once I took the kids upstairs to change out of their costumes. He'd been in the house for at least 35 minutes. What really terrified me out of everything was that they found him in the parents' bedroom, huddled inside the closet, crouched low behind their hanging clothes, like he was gonna watch them through the slats. God knows what he would have done if Mr. Till hadn't shown up when he did. They also said he had fistfuls of Mrs. Kelway's underwear in his pockets. He was apparently some kind of drifter, no fixed address, wandering through neighborhoods, looking for opportunities like this one apparently. No one really knew what his intentions were, but they didn't need to tell me for me to understand. That look in his eyes when they dragged him out, he wasn't just some petty thief. What he had planned had to be much worse than that. The Kelways were horrified, of course, but they acted like it was just some sort of freak accident. "It's lucky you called the police," Mrs. Kelway said later, brushing it off like I just stopped a burglary. I don't think it was luck, though. If Mr. Tillman hadn't seen that man in the window, if he hadn't acted quickly, I don't know if anybody would have made it out of the house. I stopped babysitting after that. How could I not? Every creak in the night, every knock at the door, it brought it all back. I go out and have fun like a normal person now. A crazy person would volunteer to babysit on Halloween. What a better way to just set yourself up. Hey everyone, thanks for listening if you stuck around to this point. If you haven't yet, please hit the like button, the subscribe button, and that notification bell to be notified when future episodes come out. If you have a true scary story of your own, you can submit it directly on my website itself or send it directly to the email itself, which both are in the description of every single video. You can stalk me on Twitter and on Instagram, or that's it because I don't really have a presence on Facebook. Either way, I hope you enjoyed this episode. I kind of just wanted to go ahead and get the Halloween stories out, kick off the season, do it right. Get one out so you can get your fix in already. I'm going to have another one closer towards the end of the month. Food delivery stories will be out tomorrow or Saturday. I'm not sure yet. More than likely tomorrow night. And then, we got some really good ones in store for this entire month. Like I said earlier, I'm gonna make it up to you guys for skipping 2 episodes this last month because of shit that just happened out of my control. Unfortunately, life tends to happen. I don't know what it is, but life just seems to be throwing stuff at me constantly and just piling it on. It's been a completely fucking wild ass 2 weeks. Thankfully, it's slowed down now. It's still very stressful, very overwhelming, but at least I'm home and we're home. Basically, just to give you a quick insight, what happened last week and why there was no episode out. So Wednesday morning, I woke up to my wife screaming bloody murder at around 6 a.m. I came downstairs and found that she had fallen down our very steep steps and her ankle and or foot was literally hanging off like perpendicular from like at a 90-degree angle from her foot itself, and the bone in her ankle was coming out of her foot. I could see the bone on the left side of her ankle as well as her foot laying limp. It was really fucking scary because I wasn't sure, initially obviously what happened and XYZ, but it was super fucking overwhelming, and thankfully she got the surgery that she needed a few days later or a day and a half later, but it's just been chaos ever since trying to take care of her, both kids, keep up with the house, run a business, record, do all this shit. It's a lot, and I know everybody out there, and I'm sure you'd have listening, you've got shit going on in your own life, and it feels like it's always moving, never stopping, always something. But it really feels like, I don't know, I thought I was gonna coast the rest of the year and nice and chill and have a good spooky season, and we're definitely still gonna do that, but it's just been fucking chaos, man, and it's been a lot. Thankfully, again, she's okay. To most of you who appreciate and understand that life happens and that I'm not a YouTuber first. I am a father and a husband first, and my family will always come first. No offense, but that's just how it's going to be. That's how it always will be on this channel. So I didn't really get a chance to kind of clue you guys in until, way later on in the week or whatever. I don't even remember what day it was, but it was last week. It happened Wednesday morning, and I was in and out of the hospital the rest of the week trying to take care of her, get everything, taken care of, and then the kids, and then everything else. And then obviously recording those stories got put on the back burner because, like I said, I'm a father and a husband first, and I am not, YouTube will always come second, which it is what it is. So I know most of you understand that. There's a few who are still bitching, but there's always those people that are bitching, right? Also, I have new merch out. I put it at the front of the last episode, but if you're even listening or still listening to this now, there's some really, really cool, an orange hoodie and a black crew neck, as well as a completely new sticker pack and window decal that will come with each and every order. If you order, in the near future, get you some nice and cozy for spooky season. Both are very super soft, very super cozy. If you're thinking about the crew neck and you like your crew necks baggy like I do, I would suggest going a size up, but that's just me. And yeah, that's really it. Again, I got a lot planned for this month, a lot coming at you, and honestly, I'm sure most of you will probably be happy that I skipped 2 weeks, because now you're gonna get 2 more episodes this month instead of more. Like, I'm thinking this, oh my god, I'm just spewing out words right now, but as I'm thinking, I'm like talking. So week 1 we'll have 3 episodes, and then as of right now, my plan is for week 3 in October to have 3 episodes as well. So, you'll get your regular 8 plus 2 more, and the Halloween episode, the next Halloween episode will be a little bit longer too. So, just look out for all that stuff. Got a lot planned, got a lot of spooky stuff, a lot of spooky content. I hope you enjoy the stories today and enjoy the stories before and enjoy the stories in the future. Again, I feel like I also need to say this, even though I've said it a million times, all the stories read on my channel are allegedly true. I cannot confirm or deny any authenticity or, validate any of it or verify any of it. I'm just reading what Zack gives me, and we're both on the same page. We're, either or. I feel like I needed to say that again, but I will stop rambling on now. What is today? Thursday. Enjoy your Thursday. Have a good weekend. I'll see you tomorrow or Saturday for food delivery stories. And yeah, I'm really excited that it's October. I absolutely love fall. I love Halloween. I love October. Spooky season is by far the best season of the entire year. So I hope you're enjoying yourself out there too. All right, guys. I love y'all. Cheers.